It was supposed to be a simple backyard cookout. Instead, Walter grabbed Ruth by the arm and pulled her out of the kitchen and into the middle of the yard, while their neighbors and half the family stood there, holding paper plates and watching in silence. "Tell me I'm wrong," he shouted, loud enough for everyone across the fence to hear. "The Hendersons paid you to cater their anniversary party. You stood in their kitchen for 2 days and came home with cash in your pocket. You want to explain that?" Ruth wiped her hands on her apron and looked at him calmly. "They asked me to help. I did the work. They paid me. You embarrassed me." He reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out a folded stack of bills, and dropped it on the grass between them. $120. I drove over there this morning and gave it back myself. Now every neighbor on this street thinks my wife is out here selling herself like a— "Walter," Ruth's voice was quiet, "that was my money." He slapped her before she finished the sentence. The yard went still. Someone near the back fence made a small sound, then nothing. Clara had been standing on the back steps with a bowl of potato salad in her hands. She set it down on the railing without looking at it and walked across the grass. She was 30 years old. She had driven 4 hours from Charlotte that morning. She had not slept the night before, because something in her mother's voice on the phone had told her not to. She knelt beside Ruth and put her hand on her mother's arm. "Mom, can you stand?" Ruth pressed her fingers against her cheek and nodded. Her eyes stayed on the grass. Walter pointed at Clara. "Stay out of it. This is between me and your mother." Clara stood up slowly and looked at her father. "If you raise your hand at her again, I will call the police from this yard with everyone watching." The silence stretched. Walter's jaw tightened, then he turned and walked back toward the house, letting the screen door slam behind him. One of the aunts laughed awkwardly from the corner. "Clara, baby, you know how your daddy gets. Let's just finish eating." Clara didn't answer. She put her arm around Ruth's shoulders and walked her inside. The phone call had come the night before, just after 10. Clara had been reviewing hotel contracts at her kitchen table in Charlotte when her cell lit up with her mother's name. Ruth never called that late. "Hey, Mom, everything okay? I just wanted to make sure you were coming tomorrow." Ruth's voice was lower than usual, like she was standing somewhere she didn't want to be overheard. "Your brother and Shayla will be here. I've got a lot of food to get through. I'll be there. What time do you need me?" "Early, before everyone else shows up." A pause. "And Clara, just try not to argue with your father, okay? You know how Sundays get." "Mom, what's actually going on?" "Nothing, sweetheart. It's late. Get some sleep." Ruth hung up first. Clara sat at her kitchen table for a long time after that, phone still in her hand. She had grown up learning to read the pauses in her mother's sentences. Every time Ruth said nothing like that, quiet and too careful, it meant something. She left Charlotte at 5 in the morning. Ruth had been awake since 3. Clara saw the evidence when she arrived. 2 pans of cornbread cooling on the stove, a whole chicken already simmered down to broth, green beans snapping in a colander in the sink. It was barely 7 o'clock, and the kitchen already smelled like a Sunday dinner at noon. "Mom, you've been here all night." "Oh, I took a little rest around midnight." Ruth smiled and handed Clara a cup of coffee. "You look tired. Did you drive straight through?" "You do this every single time." "The family's coming. Someone has to." That was the truth of it, and Clara knew it the way she knew the feel of every room in that house. Whenever there was a gathering, Easter, 4th of July, someone's birthday, a funeral repast, Ruth disappeared into the kitchen before sunrise and reappeared only when every plate was full. Walter sat in the living room entertaining people. Troy and his wife Shayla would show up around noon with a 2-liter soda and good smiles and take the seats closest to the fan. The aunts would drift in, fill plates, offer compliments that Clara always felt were somehow condescending, and leave before the dishes were done. And Ruth would still be in the kitchen, washing the last pot, long after the yard emptied. Clara took off her jacket, tied on an apron, and started chopping onions without asking permission. She had been 12 years old the first time she understood what her mother's life actually looked like. It was a Saturday. Walter had taken the grocery money for something. Clara never found out what. Ruth stood in the kitchen for a long time, opening and closing the cabinet over the stove. Then she quietly put on her shoes and walked to the neighbor's house and offered to help them with yard work in exchange for a bag of rice and some dried beans. She came home 2 hours later, face calm, like it was nothing. She made dinner. She never mentioned it. Clara went to school on a scholarship. She had applied without telling her father because she already knew what he would say, that college was a place for people who thought they were too good for honest work, and that a girl with her kind of practical sense should stay local, find a decent man, settle down. Ruth had known about the application the whole time. She helped Clara fill out the financial aid forms at the kitchen table while Walter was at his weekly card game. When the acceptance letter arrived, Ruth intercepted it from the mailbox, read it standing in the driveway, then folded it carefully and held it out to her daughter, with both hands like it was something breakable. "Don't tell your father until after you've registered," she said. The money for the first semester's books and fees came from a pair of gold earrings Ruth had been keeping in a sock at the bottom of her winter coat. Clara had never seen her mother wear them, and when she asked where they came from, Ruth just said, "They were a gift. I've been saving them for something important." Clara didn't understand until she was older. By then, it was too late to ask without both of them crying, so she never asked at all. After the slap, after Clara walked Ruth inside and sat her down at the kitchen table, with a cold cloth pressed against her cheek, after the guest finished eating and drifted away in twos and threes, the yard went quiet. Walter spent the afternoon on the porch with a glass of sweet tea and a radio program, not speaking to either of them. Ruth insisted on washing the dishes herself. Clara stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her mother's hands move through the soapy water. Efficient, practiced, not trembling, and thought about the $120 on the grass. She had picked it up before going inside. The bills were still in her pocket. She thought about the Henderson anniversary party. Her mother had spent 2 days cooking for 12 people. Fried catfish, collard greens, baked macaroni, peach cobbler, sweet potato pie. The Hendersons had pressed the money into Ruth's hands themselves, insisting it was less than minimum wage for the hours she'd put in. Walter had driven over there at 7 in the morning to return it. "Mom," Clara said, "when's the last time someone took you out to eat?" Ruth turned and looked at her daughter with an expression that was almost amused. "What kind of question is that?" "Answer it." Ruth thought for a moment. Really thought, like she was actually trying to remember. Then she let out a slow breath and turned back to the dishes. "That's what I thought," Clara said. "We're going out for your birthday tomorrow." "My birthday is not. It's in 4 days. We're going early." Clara looked at the wall calendar above the refrigerator. There was a date circled in pencil at the edge of the month, so faint she almost missed it. No one had written anything beside it. Not Walter, not Troy, no one. "I'll make a reservation." Ruth kept washing. After a moment she said, "You don't have to do all that." "I know I don't have to." They went to a restaurant in the city that Ruth had passed a dozen times on the way to the grocery store and never once gone inside. White tablecloths. A candle on the table. A server who brought water without being asked. Ruth held the menu with both hands and read it, the way people read documents they're not sure they're allowed to have. Clara ordered for both of them. When the food came, salmon, roasted vegetables, a small loaf of warm bread. Ruth looked at the plate like she was checking whether it was actually meant for her. "Take the good piece," Clara said, sliding the larger portion toward her mother. "Stop being polite." Ruth laughed. It was a short laugh, surprised out of her, and it made her look younger. They talked for almost 2 hours. Ruth told stories Clara had never heard before, about growing up in her grandmother's kitchen, about winning a pie contest at the county fair at 16, about a dream she'd had of opening a little lunch counter somewhere that served soul food, the way her grandmother used to make it, simple and honest and made from scratch. She'd had the dream before she got married. After that, she said, the cooking never stopped, but the dream did. "You're 55 years old," Clara said. "That's not old." "It feels old some days." "It's not." Clara set down her fork. "Mom, come live with me. In Charlotte. Just for a while, just to—" "Oh, Clara." "I have the room. You know I do." Ruth turned her water glass in a slow circle. "Your father—" "Dad will be fine. He's a grown man. He can figure out how to make a sandwich." Ruth didn't answer, but she didn't say no either. The trouble came 2 days later. Walter called them both into the living room in the mid-afternoon, the way he always did when he had something to announce that he'd already decided. Troy and Shayla were there too, which meant it had been planned. "Your brother needs a car," Walter said, looking at Clara. "He's got a deal falling through because he can't get to the site in time. You've got that nice one in the driveway. Sign it over to him." Clara looked at Troy. Troy looked at the floor. "I bought that car," Clara said. "You bought it with money you earned in my house. Eating food your mother cooked. I moved out 8 years ago, Dad. Walter's voice rose. Family takes care of family. That's how it's always been. Your brother needs help, and you're sitting there with more than you need. I'm not giving Troy my car. Clara kept her voice flat. If he needs transportation for a job, he can take out a loan like anyone else. Walter stood up. He was pointing his finger before he was fully on his feet. You ungrateful. You think because you went off to that city and got yourself a little title at some hotel you're better than us now? I raised you. Everything you have came from this family. You didn't pay for my education. The words came out of Clara's mouth before she decided to say them. Mom did. She sold jewelry to cover my first semester. You tried to talk me out of going. The room went very quiet. Ruth was sitting in the armchair near the window. She had been quiet the whole time, her hands folded in her lap. But something shifted in her face when Clara said that. Walter swung toward Ruth instead. You went behind my back. Those were my earrings, Ruth said. Her voice was level. Everything in this house belongs to me. Everything you have. Walter. Ruth stood up. She was not a tall woman. She stood up anyway. I cooked 31 years of meals in this house. I planted every garden in the backyard. I managed every bill and every birthday and every family gathering with whatever money you left over after your card games. Those earrings were mine before I ever met you. Walter stepped toward her. Clara moved at the same time, getting between them. Don't, Clara said. Walter stopped. He looked at his daughter, then at his wife, then back at Clara. His face was dark with something, rage maybe, or maybe something else he didn't have words for. Ruth said very quietly, I want a divorce, Walter. Nobody moved. Walter let out a short, ugly laugh. You're out of your mind. I've been thinking about it for a long time. Ruth picked up her cardigan from the arm of the chair. I've been thinking about it for a very long time. The family came, of course. Gail drove over that same evening, sat on the couch with her arms folded, and told Ruth she was making a mistake that couldn't be undone. At your age, what do you think you're going to do? Where do you think you're going to go? Ruth sat through all of it. She let Gail talk. She let the neighbor woman who came by unasked talk. She let Troy look at her with that particular expression of a child who wants his mother to make the discomfort stop. Then she went to the bedroom and called Clara. I want to pack a bag tonight. Clara was already parked in the driveway. She moved into Clara's apartment in Charlotte on a Tuesday in October, 2 suitcases and a box of kitchen things. The divorce proceedings took 4 months, 2 mediation sessions that Walter spent mostly shouting at the ceiling, and 1 final court date on a gray February morning. Ruth wore her good coat. She held the decree with both hands. When the clerk passed it across the table, the way someone holds a thing they have been waiting for without knowing it. On the drive home, Clara glanced over and saw her mother reading the document again in the passenger seat, moving her lips slightly along each line. How do you feel? Clara asked. Ruth looked up. Outside the window, Charlotte moved past in its afternoon ordinary way. Traffic lights, a dry cleaner, a woman walking a dog. Light, Ruth said. I feel light. She couldn't stay idle for long. By the 3rd week, she was reorganizing Clara's spice cabinet and making elaborate breakfasts at 6 in the morning. And Clara could see her mother's hands itching for purpose. There was a small restaurant 4 blocks away, family-owned, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu. Clara had been going there for years. She knew the owner. She asked if they'd take on a part-time cook for the lunch service, just a trial run. She said her mother was the best cook she knew. The owner, a stout woman named Bea who had been feeding that neighborhood for 20 years, said she'd give it a week. Ruth showed up that first morning in her own apron, the one she'd packed without thinking about it, because it was just a thing she always had. She didn't speak much to the kitchen staff at first. She just cooked. By Thursday, Bea was standing in the kitchen doorway, watching Ruth work the lunch rush and doing the math in her head. By the end of the month, Ruth had a regular schedule and a paycheck with her own name on it. Word got back to Walter eventually, the way things do. He had moved in with Troy and Shayla after the house felt too empty and the cooking felt too hard, which turned out to be its own kind of education for all 3 of them. Shayla, who had spent years watching Walter treat Ruth like furniture, spent exactly 1 month living under the same roof with him before she called Clara. I owe your mother an apology, Shayla said. Her voice was tired. I should have said something a long time ago. I didn't know. I knew, but I didn't understand what it actually felt like. Clara told her where Ruth was working. Shayla went on a Wednesday, sat at the counter and ordered the special. When Ruth came out of the kitchen to check on the dining room, Shayla stood up and said she was sorry. Simple as that. Ruth looked at her for a moment, then put a hand on Shayla's arm and said, "Sit down. Let me get you some pie." It was a Thursday in April when Clara stopped by the restaurant on her lunch break and found her mother laughing at something a customer had said. Really laughing, the kind that reaches the eyes. The customer was a man somewhere in his late 50s, gray at the temples, who came in 3 times a week and always ordered the same thing and always said, without fail, that it was the best meal he'd had all week. Ruth was flushed from the kitchen, and her apron had a smear of something on it, and she looked, Clara thought, more like herself than she had in 30 years. Clara took a seat at the counter and ordered coffee and watched her mother move through the dining room. Unhurried, attentive, completely at home. And understood that the woman who had pressed those earrings into her hands years ago and told her to go make something of herself had been waiting, without saying so, for someone to tell her the same thing. It had come late. Everything good in Ruth's life had come late. But late, Clara thought, was still something. Late was not the same as never. She drank her coffee and left a generous tip and walked back out into the spring afternoon, already thinking about dinner.